and then you go and you eat one, and in that moment you will finish whatever you have in front of you. You'll do that even though the fifth French fry that you're eating is no longer generating that sensory pleasurable response. It's become just an automatic behavior.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 209th episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to tune up the workings of your own brain and make sure that you're the one that remains calling the shots. Sometimes a person's own judgments and deliberations and conscious decision-making can essentially get outvoted by really strong biochemical internal pressures, sometimes personified by a little cartoon devil on the shoulder, but probably best known by the common term addiction. And today we're going to be talking with experts in two different areas of addiction, kind of a compare and contrast episode looking at old school physiological drug addiction, the kind of things that when you're in middle school, a police officer would come into your classroom and talk to you about. Don't smoke cigarettes, don't do heroin, things like that. And then talking about some decidedly newfangled addiction risks, internet addiction, video game addiction, social media addiction, vices that weren't even available to be addicted to a couple of decades ago but are very prevalent now. But going to have a couple of very interesting conversations cross-cutting between these in the style that we sometimes do, looking at both the similarities and the differences in the addictive process and also in the potential therapies. Going to be speaking with a couple of experts, Dr. Daria Kus and Dr. Nora Volkow. That'll be in the main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, as you might imagine, alcohol is going to be name-dropped as a potential villain in the world of addiction. But in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick, we're actually going to have something fairly nice to say about alcohol. The rare bright spot on alcohol's cognitive report card, not just that it makes it easier to talk to strange girls, something that you probably haven't heard of, or if you have heard of it, you probably didn't think it was true. But we'll just bait you with that for now. You'll have to wait and find out what I'm talking about at the end in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick. But for right now, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So it's somewhat ironic that one of the more violent debates going on right now in the world of academia is the debate over whether violent video games actually make people behave more violently or at least behave more emotionally callously in response to violence in real life. There are big names and big opinions on both sides of this issue. In 2015, a task force for the American Psychological Association released a report supposedly confirming that violent video games make players more aggressive. But no sooner was that report released than critics started chiming in with reports of bias and bad practices in the research. This is probably one that's not going to be settled anytime soon. But recently there was a study published in the journal Brain Imaging and Behavior that does seem to at least cut one of the potential table legs out from under the argument that violent video games cause the greater acceptance of violence in real life. In this brain scan study, they were looking for evidence of emotional desensitization at a neural level. This was a study, or actually two studies conducted at Hanover Medical School, each of which compared 14 excessive players of violent video games. That's not players of excessively violent video games, but people who played an excessive amount of these video games. In each study, the people averaged between 4 and 5 hours a day of violent video game play. The participants on average were 22 to 23 years old, all male, and they'd been playing video games since they were 6 years old on average. And they also had 14 people in each of the control groups who had never played violent video games. And what they had the participants do was lay in a brain scanner and look at a range of emotionally positive, negative, and neutral photos, most of which came from a fairly famous psychological test called the International Affective Picture System. That's affect with an A, not effect with an E. Talking about the emotional affect, which is basically, is this a positive or a negative picture? And the negative ones were pretty negative. There were dead bodies and violence and the kind of things that you would expect. The positive ones were cute little animals and cartoon unicorns and things like that. And for both the emotionally positive and emotionally negative pictures, there was an increase in brain activity over the neutral pictures, especially in the brain regions responsible for processing emotion. But what they didn't see was any variation in this between the groups of the violent video game players versus the everybody else group, said one of the researchers, Dr. Gregor Saichik. Our results suggest a need to rethink the desensitization hypothesis. Although he stressed that just because there was a null result in this particular study doesn't mean that violent video games don't do anything to people. It could just be that the behavioral or emotional changes happen further downstream in the brain's response rather than its initial processing of the sensory stimuli.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Travel Palm from the USA says, I've been listening for a while and I love the subjects covered. I'm amazed at the amount and diversity of research going on about the brain. And listener D-Mank from the USA says, "What an amazing and informative podcast. I've been listening since the beginning, and I've returned from a disabling traumatic brain injury to working on my PhD, using the info shared on this podcast. Thank you." Well, thank you to D-Mank, Traveler Palm, and everyone else that's left iTunes reviews or done any sort of social sharing of Smart Drug Smarts on the internet or in the real world. It's funny, we're going to be talking in the upcoming interview about internet addiction, and I was just reflecting on how the term binge listening for podcasts has become a pretty mainstream phrase now. Kind of said with a wink, but of course, binge eating, where the term comes from originally, is not a good thing, very much a term from the world of addiction. And I'd never want to talk anybody out of listening to episodes of the podcast, but of course, a measured, steady, consistent diet of episodes is probably better than a giant binge. You'll just get to the end too fast. You got to pace yourself. If you do find yourself getting podcast withdrawals between episodes, you can always check out The Brain Breakfast. That is our weekly-ish newsletter. And you can get signed up for that at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. Cover all kinds of stuff in there. Last one I was actually quite happy with. I recently stumbled onto and talked about in The Brain Breakfast a hack that I think would save any given person easily 30 to 50 hours of their life if they apply it consistently. I will toss that Brain Breakfast up as a standard web page so you can taste test that if you're curious. Don't want to tell you about a train that you've already missed. We'll put a link to that up at the page for this episode, smartdrugsmarts.com/209. Also conspicuously visible in the sidebar on the Smart Drug Smarts website, you will see logos and links for Axon Labs and Vitamunk. If nutritional supplements are on your holiday shopping list for anyone in particular, check out Vitamunk.com. They've got a ton of stuff over there. Everything from alpha GPC for the brain to testosterone support to digestive and metabolic health supplements. Really something for almost every category in the nutritional supplement arena. That is Vitamunk.com. Vita like vitamin, monk like Shaolin monk. And over at axonlabs.io, keeping things pretty strictly cognitive, not a wide product line, but a much loved one, Nexus and Mitogen are the two stacks over there. Nexus, a cognitive stack based around aniracetam and CDP-choline, and Mitogen, our mitochondrial enhancer, also includes sulbutamine, which is a nootropic in its own right. And you can find both Nexus and Mitogen at axonlabs.io.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I'm about to be speaking with a couple of different interviewees, the first of whom is Dr. Nora Volkow, who is the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which is an arm of the NIH being, of course, the National Institutes of Health. And the specific role of the National Institute on Drug Abuse within the NIH is to support most of the research that happens worldwide on the health aspects of drug abuse and addiction. Dr. Volkow has been extremely prolific over the course of her career, has almost 700 peer-reviewed articles to her name. She's been named by Time magazine as one of the top 100 people who shape our world, a two-time award recipient from Washingtonian magazine as one of the 100 most powerful women, and was the subject of her own profile piece by 60 Minutes back in 2012. And not surprisingly, of the two interviewees, she's the one who will be speaking about drug addiction, as opposed to some of the tech addictions that I'll be talking about with our second interviewee, Dr. Daria Kus, who's both a chartered psychologist and a senior lecturer in psychology at Nottingham Trent University in the UK. And one of her main research and teaching interests is in the area of cyberpsychology, the study of how people interact with technology and the internet in particular. And Nottingham Trent University is actually offering a master's program now in cyberpsychology, which is a first in the UK. But two very interesting conversations on related topics coming up. So here we go, talking about addiction with Drs. Nora Volkow and Daria Kus.
First of all, drugs activate the brain by actually literally hijacking the reward systems that are normally there to motivate actions that are necessary for survival. So we do things because they are pleasurable, rewarding, and on the other hand, we avoid things that can be harmful. And drugs directly activate that system, and that's why in many instances, it's so very easy to feel good by just taking a drug as opposed to doing other behaviors that take much more effort. And this makes drugs dangerous because when this system is stimulated, generates a very strong memory. That's the way it is programmed to do. And in that way, you very rapidly learn that that stimulus, the drug, is pleasurable. And by that memory, then itself will generate the motivation to seek it out. So it's a very perverse way on how drugs are taking a process that's extraordinary, because in that way, when you find food, for example, in an area and you eat it, you immediately remember and associate that area with that pleasurable response, so that next time when you're walking by there, unbeknownst to you in any way that you are doing it consciously, you have hunger and desire to eat something. And that will therefore motivate you to seek the stimulus. So that's how drugs work, by actually hijacking that reward motivation learning process.
So I have now been studying the intersection between society and technology, the brain behavior and technology really for over 10 years. And I've always been very interested in understanding, on the one hand, why we use technology, how it adds to our lives, but also how it can contribute to how we feel about ourselves and our environment. And my most recent research really shows that people are so engrossed in using their technology, particularly now with mobile technology, things such as their relationships and their mental health can suffer quite tremendously. And I would like to learn with my research to find ways in which we can approach using technology in a more healthy way and really focus on its benefits and try to get over any kinds of problems it may cause.
In people that are vulnerable, that can lead these memories to actually prioritization of that behavior over everything else. So which doesn't normally happen for other stimuli. So you can get this learning for food, motivate your action, but then when you're outside that context, you are basically distracted by everything else. Well, drugs in those that are vulnerable can generate such a powerful memory that even if you are outside of that context, you keep on seeking the drug. So your brain has lost that flexibility that allows you to adapt to different environments and to act in those environments in a way that will be most beneficial to you. And so the research that has emerged is actually helping us understand how that has come about. What are the changes at the cellular level? Why is it that certain pathways are strengthened and others are weakened? And at the network level, the circuitry level, what are those circuits that get affected in the process?
You said within that statement, those that are vulnerable, implying that some people are more vulnerable than others, or maybe that some people aren't vulnerable at all. How come some people sort of get ensnared apparently more easily or stay ensnared more easily than others?
There are multiple factors that determine your vulnerability, and one of them that has, obviously from the research perspective, been a fascinating field is what are the genetics that make you vulnerable to becoming addicted? And we know that addiction has a very strong hereditary component because now we know from epidemiological studies that if you are born in a family where people are alcoholics or taking drugs, you are much more likely to become addicted. What has not been clear is which are the genes that are responsible for that hereditary component on addiction. And it's estimated that perhaps 50% of risk may be genetically determined. And so that's one element. The other element is also clear, also from epidemiological studies, that there are certain environmental factors that increase your vulnerability to addiction. And so, for example, if you are brought up as a child in an environment where your parents are not there, that you don't have any mentor or support person that guides you through, that you are not giving opportunities to develop social relationships, that those environments with very strong stressors are actually going to significantly increase your vulnerability for addiction. If you have a mental illness, for example, you have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or depression or even schizophrenia, that also increases your vulnerability. Another factor very important in vulnerability is the age at which you start taking drugs. And again, regardless of which drug you're speaking of, the younger you start taking them, the greater the likelihood that you become addicted. And so there are multiple factors that are determining your vulnerabilities. And also we are now coming to recognize, and again, it's one of the most fascinating areas of science, that those genes that make you vulnerable, why are they making you vulnerable? What do they do to your brain? And so, for example, how do they influence the normal developmental trajectory? And how do they influence the architecture of the brain? And through influencing how the brain's architecture is formed, how it functions, then it determines how you respond to the environment. So now we know, for example, you can have all of the genes that make you vulnerable, but if you are in a very protected environment, you will never become addicted. So these are some of the really very exciting areas. Research is just starting to help us understand how genes influence the development of the brain and how then those changes influence the way that we respond to the environment.
Do you think that there are parallels to the widespread adoption of the internet that has been going on now for the last 15, 20 years with other historical technology changes that have been widely adopted?
Well, I'm often being asked, whether there are parallels with other types of media that have come into our lives at some stages. And yes, of course, there are parallels. So often what happened in the history of media, and particularly in terms of media studies, you will find that new technologies have emerged and people may have not been particularly happy with the kinds of effects using that technology can have on their lives. So, for example, when we had the emergence of television, there was some sort of a moral panic that surrounded that emergence. Nevertheless, there is quite a substantial difference with the kinds of technologies that we have nowadays. And I think the main difference is interactivity. So really, we're going from a passive consumption of media content, such as television, to an active engagement with media forms. And this is the main reason why I think people are much more likely to use this kind of technology, mobile technology specifically, to potentially excessive degrees.
We talk about internet addiction now. Should we be thinking of that more as addiction in sort of curly quotes, or legitimately considering that alongside more physiological addictions?
Yeah, that's a very good question. You may be aware of the Psychiatrist's Bible, the DSM, so the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders.
Yeah.
Now, the most recent edition in 2013 has included internet gaming disorder in their appendix as a condition that requires additional research in order to be included in the main manual. And it's the only other behavioral addiction other than pathological gambling that has been included in this manual. And this would really suggest that actually nowadays, excessive gaming and excessive internet use are potentially being viewed as real mental disorders, on par with other addictions such as substance-related addictions, alcoholism, drug use, etc. So I think we are really thinking about internet addiction from a clinical perspective, indicating that a small minority of excessive users of the internet and excessive users of online gaming and video gaming may indeed develop symptoms which have traditionally been associated with substance-related addictions. And my research actually also shows that there are striking similarities between internet addiction and other kinds of substance-related addictions. Generally speaking, you could almost say that internet addictions and gaming addictions are extremely similar in the ways in which they affect the brain, they affect the behavior, and they affect how people feel about themselves and the other people around them in their own life world. So there are striking similarities, and we really need more research in order to figure out what we can do in order to prevent any kinds of addictions from developing in the first place.
Do you see at a social policy level a time maybe in the future when we know more about the genetic risk factors, that the general message of just don't try drugs, it's not worth the risk, might change if a certain kid is found to be like genetically a very low risk of addiction, or even somebody, let's say in their mid-20s?
I foresee that one day from happening. But I also foresee that even if you don't have any of the risk panel of genes that make you vulnerable, you may still want to actually send a message of avoid to take drugs as an adolescent, because even though you don't have the gene, the brain, when you are an adolescent, is tremendously plastic, and it has to be that way because the development is very long in the human brain, 20 years, for a purpose, so that it ultimately has the organization and architecture that will be optimal for dealing with the environment in which you are going to be living. And so if you start to interfere with that by giving drugs, then of course your brain is going to adapt to that potential environmental factor. And that could lead and open the door to vulnerability for addiction, independent of you not having the genetic risk. The other element, for example, that would be very valuable if we were to be able to recognize where would it be helpful in terms of prevention efforts is now that we're living with an opioid crisis in our country. One of the big question marks that doctors are asking, if I'm going to be giving an opioid medication to a patient with pain, how do I know if that person is vulnerable to become addicted to their medication? It's a very important question. And so when research emerges, it is very likely that we will be able to have tests that allow a physician to determine, based on genetic risk, whether that person is at higher or lower risk to become addicted.
Let's compare a couple of famous prime candidates for physical addiction, alcohol and opioids. How much are the risks correlated here? If somebody is a prime candidate for being an alcohol addict, are they also very likely to be equally susceptible to opioids, or do these kind of diverge into sort of different candidate pools for people that might be susceptible to one versus the other?
I would speak about actually three different clusters. So there is a group of individuals that has an overall increased risk of addiction, and it doesn't really matter whether it is alcohol or cocaine or heroin. And in general, that may connote, for example, risk associated with poor executive control, so that the brain processes that normally allow you to self-regulate and say, I want this, but I'm not going to do it because it's not a good idea, then that will make you vulnerable not just to experimenting with a series of drugs, but also repeatedly using them, which increases the risk of addiction. Then you have those that relate more to the characteristics of the drug itself, or so the pharmacological properties. But what happens is that drugs have commonalities between them. So, for example, you have drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine that are stimulant drugs. Basically, if you have in general, the vulnerability for one stimulant drug, it is likely that you may have the vulnerability for the other. And interestingly, when you are dealing with the two drugs that you mentioned, alcohol and opioids, heroin or morphine or OxyContin, both of them are very prominently engaging the endogenous opioid system, the opioid system that in our brain allows us to feel good, gives us a sense of well-being. So in that respect, they have commonalities. And certain genes that, for example, make you more vulnerable for heroin addiction apparently are also increasing your vulnerability for alcoholism. And then you have the third cluster that relates specifically to a different type of interaction that is also specific for the drug. And so, for example, you may be genetically vulnerable to high levels of anxiety. And in that case, that will put you vulnerable for alcoholism, because if you drink alcohol, that will decrease your anxiety levels. If you, on the other hand, for example, have a problem on sustaining attention and you really cannot focus or organize yourself, that may make you vulnerable to take stimulant drugs, because while you're intoxicated, they may give you a temporary compensation for those deficits. And that relates to the use of these drugs as an auto-medication. Yeah. So yes, you can have both the situation where you have someone that's vulnerable to multiple drugs, and then those that are vulnerable for specific types of drugs.
People really can't go cold turkey on the internet these days, and nor would you want to. I mean, but it's too cooked into just normal participation in civil society. So where should people start looking for sort of the danger zone, or like the orange line fading into the red do not enter area, where people could really be seeing themselves get into trouble?
The amount of time that you spend on the internet, or the amount of time that you spend gaming, does not suffice for any kind of diagnosis. So if I was to play games for 8 hours a day, every day, then it wouldn't necessarily mean that I'm addicted to gaming, for example. And this is one of the problems that the media are portraying in a way that may be quite problematic, and in a way that parents might be quite frightened about their children's behaviors, particularly if they spend a number of hours on the internet or engaged in gaming. Rather than looking at the time they spend using this kind of technology, I think there are a number of other criteria which are significantly more powerful and may indicate the existence of a problem. So, for example, one of the main problems that people experience when they come and seek professional help for their excessive internet use is the loss of control. So once they realize they can't actually control their own behaviors anymore, they're not the masters of what it is that they do in their lives anymore, but the actual behavior the internet use has taken over. I think that's one of the key criteria that might make us realize, well, actually, there might be a problem that they can't overcome themselves, and therefore they may require professional help. Another main criterion is really the emergence of problems in such a way that they can't commit to their relationships anymore. All the time that they have is spent on gaming, on using the internet, and therefore has detrimental impacts for their relationships, for their job opportunities, for their school opportunities when they're still in school and going to university, for example. These people may fail their exams, they may not be able to complete their university degrees. I have had clients talking to me who have lost their long-term relationships with their husbands and their wives as a consequence of their gaming behaviors, or people who are not able to engage with their daily life activities with regards to their jobs anymore, and then lost their jobs. So once something significant happens, such as a breakdown of a relationship or really losing a job, people often realize actually that excessive gaming or the excessive internet use may be so problematic that it can potentially be classed as an addiction. And then they may realize, yes, I need additional help because I can't deal with it myself anymore.
When we talk about internet addiction, is that too broad an umbrella? Are there really only certain types of usage that tend to be problematic?
That is a very good question. And what we know from the clinical context and also what we know from research in the area nowadays, it tends to suggest that gaming may be the most problematic activity. It certainly has been the activity that has been researched most. And this may be due to the fact that games very often have inherent structural characteristics, such as the kinds of rewarding mechanisms that those games have, or the possibilities of social interaction these games offer, the possibilities of achievement, building a reputation. And this is significantly easier to do in the game than in real life, and this may really motivate individuals to continue playing those kinds of games. But in addition to games or gaming, potentially excessive gaming, what we also find is that a small minority of excessive internet users are also experiencing problems as a consequence of their social networking site use, for example. These are very often female users who are engaging in using Facebook, they use Twitter, they use Snapchat. Instagram has very recently been shown to be potentially problematic, particularly for individuals who may be particularly vulnerable to developing problems as a consequence of their internet use. So it's not just the gaming that may result in problems. There may be other activities that could also lead to addiction-related symptoms, such as using social networking sites.
Do you think that's because of the what's called gamification of social networking sites? How many likes you get on something, sort of almost being akin to how many points you rack up in a game?
Yeah, this is quite an interesting analogy. So gamification of social networking sites may contribute to the increased problems that may be experienced as a consequence of using these kinds of websites. It's not just the gamification, it's really being able to see people and be seen. The kinds of like functions really would refer to how a person views themselves. The more likes you receive, better your self-confidence, more increased will be your self-esteem, etc. And the gamification may contribute to that. However, it's not the one criterion that would make social networking potentially problematic for a small number of excessive users.
Basically, you see it in most instances for addiction, and the patients themselves will tell you, says, I don't even know why I'm taking this drug. It's no longer even pleasurable. Yet I cannot stop taking it. And underlying that I cannot stop taking it is individuals that are addicted to drugs when they are not under the effects of the drug are very uncomfortable. They are irritable, they are anxious, they are depressed, nothing feels good, nothing excites you, and it's a very uncomfortable state, and your brain is actually designed to lead you to do things to get you out of that state. Mm-hmm. It's like the concept of boredom. Why do we feel boredom? It's an incentive for our brain to act and get us out of that state. So the same thing when we feel uncomfortable and nothing is right in our skin, it moves us towards doing something to get out of it. And what you have learned in the process is that drugs will temporarily make you feel better. But now you're taking them to temporarily feel better as opposed to having this extreme sense of pleasure and well-being that you feel when you first start to experiment with these drugs.
What is the minimum viable level of exposure that a person would really need in order to get physiological dependence?
Physiological dependence is when you take a drug and then you stop taking it and you get physical withdrawal. But that's different from addiction. And so not all of the drugs that one takes produce this strong physical withdrawal. And you can have physical withdrawal and dependence without being addicted. So which are the drugs that produce the most intense physical dependence, which is, again, referring to the symptoms that emerge when you stop taking them? Probably the drugs that produce this the fastest is the opioids. And if you've ever been treated in the hospital you've been admitted and given opioids for a couple of days and you stop abruptly, you will feel physical dependence. You will feel restless, anxious, very, very disagreeable within a couple of days. Now, that's not becoming addicted. Addicted is you can actually have physical dependence or not. Some of the drugs produce very minimal physical dependence. For example, cocaine, the symptoms of physical dependence are you feel somewhat tired, withdrawn, you cannot sleep well, but nothing major. Many patients don't even perceive them. That's different for heroin, and it's very different also for alcohol. Now, when you are addicted to a drug and you have physical dependence, that's probably the worst of the worst, because you are trying to say, okay, I want to stop taking this drug, and you go through the treatment, and then the withdrawal symptoms are so disagreeable that you have to overcome them, and not everybody succeeds. So that's when they frequently relapse. But then if they are able to stay clean for, say, 2 weeks, the physical dependence is no longer there, but the craving and the memory and the drive to get the drug is still there. And that's what's addiction. That's long-term memory process, the strengthening of pathways that lead you to give preeminence to seeking the drug over anything else. I like to speak about it akin to put your brain in a state of utter deprivation, like when you haven't eaten for days, and that hunger, that drive, that motivates your behavior. That's exactly what addiction is doing to you, as if it were necessary for you to survive, that mental state of you better do something because otherwise you're not going to survive. It's a hijacking of that system of alertness for survival.
Sociologically, you almost wish that there was a way to give everybody a taste of addiction for like a day, so the people who have never experienced that could kind of know what it's like, I guess, from the other side.
I mean, I'm trying to always understand what is it that a person is feeling, because it's very easy for us from the outside and says, well, why don't you just stop it? And I always like to refer on myself and sort of says there are clearly many instances where I didn't want to do a behavior and yet I was unable to stop it because I didn't have the willpower in that moment not to do it. That makes me aware if I, which are not addicted to anything and overall has a very well-structured life with a lot of reinforcers, even under certain conditions, I'm unable to self-regulate at the level that I would want. Imagine that at the extreme, where no matter what you do, you are basically unable to prevent a behavior from happening. And you know that it's going to have devastating consequences. You hate yourself for it. Because it is, again, that loss of self-esteem. I cannot even regulate my behaviors to the most elemental level.
One of the common elements when people fall into an addictive behavior with the internet usage is there's oftentimes sort of a social reputation that they're building up as a part of that. When I'm thinking about the real world analogy of gambling addiction, typically somebody that spends all day, playing the slot machine, you get no social benefit from doing that. If anything, the people walking by you in the casino kind of look down at you and they're like, wow, you look like you've been there 8 hours. You suck. There's no social benefit to your reputation. Is that just an interesting contrast, or is there something to be explored there?
Social reputation, gaining a reputation in the game, particularly in one of those more sophisticated online games such as massively multiplayer online role-playing games, popular games such as World of Warcraft, for example, they really entail players being able to progress in the game, make a name for themselves in the game, build up a reputation that is based on spending many, many hours in the game and building the reputation, building their character, acquiring a number of items in the game that make them stand out from the rest of other players. And in comparison to real life, building up their reputation is significantly easier and takes significantly less time and effort in the game than in real life. So, for example, in the game, you can spend a few months gaming every day, gaming many hours every day, building up their reputation, becoming that wonderful person, in-game avatar that people are admiring, really. Whereas in life, it might take you tens and tens of years to be able to have a similar reputation. And then you can really see the appeal for people who might not actually receive that achievement or that acknowledgement from their community in real life, who may then try and receive that in the game. It will give them the motivation to continue the game. It will give them the motivation to become something special in the game, who is admired by the gaming community. And therefore, it might be one of the reasons for why people may continue playing those games, even though they may realize that actually they might be better off spending their time engaging with their real-life communities.
Where do you see the path forward, whether it's better education or better science or some combination of the above? Like, what will we be able to do to prevent or treat addiction 10 to 15 years from now that we can't do currently for either social or scientific reasons?
Well, I think that to start with, we can do a lot right now in terms of prevention. And that is the way that you do it is by communicating in ways that are salient to children and teenagers about what is it that drugs do and do not do. And very importantly, by providing children and teenagers as they grow up with alternative behaviors that are reinforcing. Because if you don't do that, then our brain is hardwired to seek out reinforcing behaviors that drive your everyday life. So if you don't have that, you will fall into take drugs. So I want to highlight that we can do a lot right now by prevention, by investing on prevention, which again means providing an environment that can support the growth of an individual. Now, what is it that we may be able to do into the future? Into the future, we may be able to basically by doing, for example, a thorough assessment of an individual, of their brain development, determine what are their vulnerabilities. So we were speaking before, one of the factors that puts you at risk of taking drugs is when the frontal cortical areas of your brain that normally are responsible for self-regulation are not fully developed and they are not properly connected or are not properly functioning. So that puts you at high risk of impulsive behaviors, and among which can be drug taking. Mm-hmm. So we will be able, and actually researchers are already doing that in teenagers that may have delayed development of the frontal areas of the brain, to do the equivalent of training exercises to strengthen the processes and therefore improve the outcomes. And the more we know about the brain, and the more we are able to actually develop targets that, just like we do right now, you go to the gym and they tell you which muscles you want to strengthen. As we know about the brain, we may be able to do that. That's one. The second one, very important, which you were asking, is through genetics, we will also be able to have a better perspective about what may be our unique vulnerabilities. And as I mentioned, you can get into the world of addiction not just by the fact that say, oh, I'm going to get high, but you could get addicted because you go to your doctor, they give you a treatment, and then you become addicted to the treatment. So being able to understand what the whole vulnerability is could be very valuable as we look into the future. And a third element that we're looking into right now is, could it be possible to provide vaccines, for example? And again, this is very ambitious, and the challenges in terms of the technology are far from trivial. But if we're able to succeed in getting vaccines that immunize you long-term for drugs that can be very harmful in those that are vulnerable, you may be able to protect them and prevent the disease from ever emerging again. So figuring out a way that you can do an intervention that can strengthen the supports, the internal supports that an individual has as they are growing up, could be a very good way of preventing them from ending up taking drugs.
I can remember from when I was in high school, you'd have posters on the walls that get high on sports, not drugs. I mean, obviously that's been something that we've been aware of for a long time, that giving people viable, socially acceptable ways of getting that dopamine rush or whatever is going to be effective. But obviously some people still slip through the cracks. That's not a foolproof solution for everybody.
Yeah, no, we know about it, and there's not one single solution for all, and there are individuals that are extremely vulnerable, and not everyone, even if you tell them this will help you, will be able to engage in those sports, either because they don't have the resources or because they don't have the motivation and the social support to help them go into it, or maybe because their brain just does not resonate to physical activity. Again, this is why highlighting the notion of when we're speaking about prevention, it does require investment on infrastructure. And it's not automatic that certainly there are universal prevention interventions that can overall at your population level have an effect in preventing children from getting exposed to drugs. But those universal preventions in general are not very beneficial for those that are at higher risk. And so when we're speaking, yes, we've known for a long time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we've implemented this knowledge. That basically, unfortunately, for the most part, has not happened.
Switching a little to therapy, if somebody recognizes that they are one of these people for whom internet addiction or gaming addiction is a detrimental force in their life and they sort of are trying to break the habit, where have you seen people have successes and failures in the strategies in pulling back from this?
So I'm actually describing these sorts of things in the book that I'm currently writing on the therapy of internet addiction, which has also been the topic of my previous book that has been published in 2015. So when you think about the kinds of strategies that are being implemented in the context of treatment for internet addiction and gaming addiction, one very interesting approach is, in the context of gaming, a person who may be spending a lot of time in one of those very interesting and very complex online games, such as massively multiplayer online role-playing games, may print out an actual screenshot of their avatar, their in-game character, to take into one of the therapeutic sessions and then really say goodbye to that character in that session. So a therapeutic approach in the context of cognitive behavioral therapy for gaming addiction would really require of the individual to say goodbye to their main gaming character and really initiate some sort of a grief reaction, a grief response, being able to close that chapter of their lives and move on from that particular gaming. It wouldn't necessarily mean that they would have to cease using the internet in the first place. It would just mean really saying goodbye to that stage of their lives where they have been engaging in gaming with a particular gaming character for an extended and excessive period of time. And actually using that kind of an approach, using that grief reaction to get over the associated emotions and feelings, really is very beneficial for the clients, particularly if this is being presented in the group therapy session, where you've got a number of clients who are working together in order to overcome their gaming addiction. Together they can work at really overcoming these kinds of strong emotions that are being associated with the gaming character and moving on from there. So it's one of the interesting and very useful techniques that seem to be quite helpful in the treatment session.
That sounds like a fascinating combination of dealing with a romantic breakup and also dealing with being fired from a job, kind of merged into one.
Absolutely. You really need to bear in mind, particularly in the context of gaming, gamers develop their characters often over years and years and years. So those gaming characters, those so-called avatars, they are virtual representations of their real-life identities. You know, they are stronger, they're more powerful, they're probably bigger in size, they have better equipment, etc. And therefore really letting go of that better version of yourself is quite difficult. And I think what you will find is there are striking similarities between those great representations of individuals within the gaming and representations of yourself within social networking sites. So for example, Instagram, that social sharing site, is quite interesting to see how people present themselves and how they present their lives to be wonderful. So nobody's going to post pictures on Instagram when they've just woken up early in the morning after a heavy night's drinking, because it would be quite silly to do, wouldn't it? So instead what they're going to do is to post pictures before they go out. They are nicely made up, they look lovely and gorgeous, and they post pictures of their new car or their wonderful holidays. And this is really that self-presentation which makes you appear as if you're a better version of yourself, often very, very unrealistic and very far from reality. And this is one of the reasons for why problems can emerge as a consequence of using social networking sites such as Instagram.
Therapeutically, what you just described for somebody leaving a massive multiplayer role-playing game, what would the parallel be with somebody who is addicted to a social networking site?
Dealing with social networking sites or an addiction to social networking sites hasn't received as much in research as has the excessive use of gaming. And therefore, there is very little knowledge out there what we can do in terms of helping individuals who may use social networking sites excessively. But personally, from my experience with working with clients who may have problems as a consequence of that, what I would recommend would be to ideally delete the accounts if at all possible and spend more time in real-life relationships, because very often what you will find is that those social networking sites are being used for the purpose of maintaining real-life contacts. Rather than maintaining those contacts via the internet, I would very strongly recommend to try and maintain these in real-life settings and really get back to just having simple conversations with your real-life friends on an afternoon when you finish work, rather than just spending hours and hours on Facebook or Twitter or any other kind of social networking site. And I think it's particularly problematic for young individuals nowadays who are using these kinds of social networking sites. I see it with my own university students. They are very engrossed in using social networking, using their mobile phones, etc. And sometimes it is quite difficult to draw their attention away from those mobile devices. So what we need to do as a society is to ensure that those young people are learning the skills of holding a regular conversation and of not being distracted every 5 minutes by some beeping going off on their phones. It's going to be very interesting to see how that's going to develop over the next 20 or 30 years.
It seems like there's a pretty strong awareness now that the overprescription of opioid painkillers is very much to blame for the current opioid crisis. Has that changed? Is the behavior among doctors basically making the barrier to entry to get access to these drugs too low? Is that a problem that's been solved now and we're just dealing with the aftermath? Or is this an ongoing problem?
It's slowly improving, and actually from 2011 to 2015, for example, we have seen around a 15% decrease in the total number of prescriptions that have been dispensed for opioids. but we're still at a very, very high level of opioid prescription, which then facilitates the diversion and abuse of these drugs. And many patients are still being given very, very high doses for very long periods of time, and that puts them at risk. At the same time, we don't really have system in the healthcare system itself that can provide with the treatment for pain that patients need. So we're in a difficult situation there because we have a very large number of patients that suffer from chronic severe pain for which there are not many alternative medications, and not that opioids are very effective in general for chronic pain either, but for some of them, they can provide some relief. So we have several gaps that we need to address in order to say, well, we've been able to solve it. We need to actually continue to do aggressive training and education for physicians so that they know how to properly prescribe opioids and minimize and stop that overprescription that we've seen in our country for the past close to 20 years. But the other one is we have to realize that we do need to invest more on the development of therapies for pain that are safer and effective. And that requires the willingness of the insurance systems, the Medicaid, the Medicare, to be willing to pay also for these alternative treatment modalities that in many instances may be more expensive than opioids.
Let's say that there was an equally effective painkiller out there that worked on a different mechanism of action than opioids do. Would we still be running into the same problem because basically the same learning pathway would still be engaged? Like, this particular substance makes my pain go away, therefore I learn to seek this substance, even if there's social barriers to my doing so? I mean, are we just going to basically make a new whack-a-mole problem pop up?
No. And there's evidence actually to suggest that that's not an imperative. The reason why drugs produce this very strong learning and that then leads to automatic behaviors that are basically at the essence of addiction is that it stimulates the dopaminergic pathways. And that stimulation is what generates this memory process. So you can actually have, and we know, for example, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, and some of them for certain pain conditions can be extraordinarily effective. And yet you don't create that craving or desire for this type of drugs, whereas you do for the opioids, because the opioids, in addition to actually directly inhibiting signaling in the pain networks in our brain, they activate dopamine in the reward system, creating the memory. That's the problem of opioids.
So really, it's the dopaminergic drugs are the ones to watch out for with potential addiction consequences.
Correct.
I remember it was a big, shocking revelation in maybe the early 90s when it became clear that cigarette companies were devoting a lot of research dollars in order to maximizing the addictiveness of cigarettes. I feel like that's in almost every industry now. I mean, certainly the video game industry would be another one, but almost anything. You could say, Facebook probably tries to make itself as psychologically addictive as possible to just keep people coming back and continuing to interact with whatever product or service is being offered. Is that just something that society has to suck it up and deal with it? Or do you see there being any way of saying, hey, look, we're learning a lot more about the brain. Intellectually, we have a better understanding of how we can addict the human monkey, but we need to sort of put certain systems in place to keep the know-how from being used in a way that's socially detrimental?
I'm going to laugh at that because it's actually, of course, that's completely antithetical to what someone with a business wants to do.
Yeah.
And we basically targeted, that's the way that you target very appealing product. Make it salient, make it reinforcer, make it in a way that it can activate those dopaminergic pathways. And as we know more about what are the type of stimulus that engage that dopaminergic system, we actually will be able to tailor even more powerful reinforcers. But even without being able to look inside the brain, researchers, behaviorists had actually documented, for example, many years ago, Skinner showed this, that if you are in a situation of gambling and there is an unexpected reinforcer, that is much more powerful as a drive than one that is predictable. So if you want to generate that perseverative behavior, you actually have to deliver an unexpected reinforcer here and there. And so with Facebook or with even just your regular email, you can rapidly become compulsive about it because you know that eventually you will get an email that's going to be pleasurable. They'll tell you, well, your paper got accepted, or you'll get one that says, okay, your favorite friend is coming to town and it's going to visit you, even though the 100 of the rest of the emails are basically trash and some of them with bad news. So that ability of an unexpected reinforcer to engage the dopamine system, and how we know that they do, is actually what many of these companies are driving for.
Yeah.
And we've done it at the extreme. Well, for example, with food. With food, are manufacturing extremely reinforcing and rewarding food that can result in that compulsive pattern of overconsumption. And it's not by pure chance that those products are being developed. They are being developed specifically to target those behaviors. And many of these foods also generate very rapidly these patterns of compulsiveness. So if you go into French fries and you go to McDonald's, I mean, the French fries smell incredibly well. And then you go and you eat one, and you know in that moment you will finish whatever you have in front of you. You'll do that even though that the fifth French fry that you're eating is no longer generating that sensory pleasurable response. It's become just an automatic behavior.
I remember thinking just how ingenious it was, sort of but diabolically ingenious, of putting the playgrounds inside McDonald's, because then the kids are associating play and good times with their friends with this food product, which really they're two totally different experiences, but the McDonald's food gets the halo effect from the playground.
And we do that for everything. And that's why when you have these cars, you have these beautiful people going around, and it's reinforcing and rewarding. And we've seen that has been shown. If you look at a beautiful face, that activates your dopamine system. So there is this association immediately. So it's used by everyone, I would say, basically on advertisement, whether they are doing it on purpose or they basically learn that these tools are effective. I would say that many of them may not know exactly what the neurobiology is, but they've learned that these tools are effective. Now we know why they are effective.
I'm wondering if there have been studies looking at the parallels, I guess, between gaming addiction and workaholism.
Theoretically speaking, you could think that, yes, indeed, there are similar things going on, particularly in terms of the kind of addiction criteria that may be affected by workaholism or maybe by using gaming, indeed, yes. The distinguishing factor really between gaming and work is really gaming is a pastime activity which is really the opposite to working. So typically people would play games because they want to enjoy themselves, they want to have fun, they want to engage in something that is enjoyable and that is completely different from their working life. However, there are gamers indeed who have now made their gaming into a profession. So you may have heard of those professional gamers who are indeed making money, who are making a living out of gaming. You'll really find an increasing blurring between the boundaries of what is a game and what is work. So there may be quite striking similarities across these two platforms.
I wonder about that, though, because I kind of feel like it's like, oh, well, what are you going to do after university? Well, I'm going to get a job. It's like that's what you do. I feel like maybe gaming doesn't always start as somebody overtly seeking fun, as just sort of going with the flow, much the same way as people go into the workforce.
Well, gaming can indeed be a very social activity. So what you will find is that lots of gamers are indeed gaming online with their real-life friends in order to engage in something that they all find pleasurable. So rather than going outside and play soccer together, they may stay inside and play an online game, a computer game together. So that is indeed something that is happening nowadays. And in general, I think it's very beneficial. It is very beneficial in terms of community building. It is very beneficial in terms of allowing individuals to get together in a virtual space, engaging with one another in a social way. It is also shown to improve hand-eye coordination. Good gaming has also been shown to lead to improved surgical skills among surgeons who are dealing with very complicated surgery, for example. Generally, I think there are very many benefits that come with engagement in gaming.
Do people that game primarily with people that they actually have real-world social relationships with tend to fare better than people for whom the people they game with online are completely anonymous to them in the real world?
So the thing is, when gamers are playing games online with their real-life friends, that this would suggest that they are actually still engaging with their real-life communities because they're engaging with their real-life friends in the virtual context. What happens with online gamers who are only playing with, let's say, random other gamers in the online world? They spend all of their time gaming rather than engaging with their real-life communities, really have as a social contact only those people in the game, and then you can see that there's indeed, or there may be a problem that is emerging. Often what you will find with excessive gamers is the fact that they are indeed socially quite anxious people. They may be socially phobic. They may find it very difficult to engage with their real-life communities, and maybe much easier for them to actually be social outside of the real life, because, on the internet, they will not necessarily be judged by their gender. They won't be judged by their hair color, what kind of nationality they have, how they speak, what they're wearing, what they look like. All they're going to be judged by is going to be their gaming skills, and therefore you can see how all those kinds of social pressures may be formed by the wayside for individuals who are using those games. And therefore, it may be very beneficial in terms of building new social contacts for these individuals that may be socially anxious in real life, but it may also propagate a problem and exacerbate a problem that may be there in real life as well.
I feel like a bad person even asking this, but is there a neurobiological learning hack here? Like, let's say that I had some completely pure bunch of heroin at my disposal. I've never used heroin before, but I want to learn Japanese. Could I strategically study my Japanese while doing just enough heroin to really activate my dopamine system and sort of trick my brain into learning the Japanese better than I otherwise would, using that as sort of a neurobiological lever?
It's an interesting one, and absolutely, I think that, I wouldn't go with heroin, because heroin, what would happen is it would sort of sedate you some. So that defeats the purpose. But on the other hand, what you want to do is to enhance the dopaminergic system to such a point that it makes it salient, and you're favoring these memory components and attention, because that's the other thing it does. Its purpose is to make you do, when you generate these dopamine signals, memories, to do that behavior in the future, or to avoid doing that behavior if it was aversive. So that's actually one of the proposed mechanisms. I've basically, through my own research, been showing why stimulant medications that we have, like amphetamine, Adderall, or methylphenidate, Ritalin, may be helping children with ADHD, because what they are doing is they are enhancing dopaminergic signaling, and that is making whatever activity you are doing much more salient. And by making that activity much more salient, of course, you are much more engaged, you are much more interested, and you sustain your attention. And that will lead you to perform better. And as you know, stimulant medications are used off the counter by normal people, in some instances, to learn or prepare for an exam or prepare for something that is very demanding, for which they feel that these stimulant drugs could help them do better. So the trick with this mechanism is that you become tolerant, and then if you don't have the drug on board, then what happens is you are working at a lower level. So the brain is very homeostatic. Biology is homeostatic. You're trying to maintain a certain range. So if you give a drug to overstimulate it, then what happens is that the brain will reset itself. And that's part of why these type of approaches don't really work very well as cognitive enhancers to improve your performance. They help if you have ADHD, but again, if you are a healthy person, there's really not strong evidence. If you've basically been sleep deprived and extremely tired and doing a task that's repetitive, they can improve your performance. But if you are engaged, you're awake, you're fully alert, you're engaged on something that is driving you, and you take one of these stimulant drugs, it may actually impair your performance. So it's a tricky balance.
It does make me think that the criminalizing of a lot of these drugs, combined with the dopaminergic and the learning feedback mechanism that we talked about, criminalizing is really counterproductive, because a lot of people, if they're taking a dopaminergic drug and knowing that what they're doing is illegal and they're kind of flipping the bird to society, then they're getting this positive feedback while they're in flipping the bird to society mode instead of learning Japanese mode or whatever sort of generally socially beneficial thing would be. It's exactly what you don't want. You don't want to normalize those behaviors and make them want to do more of that thing.
Yeah, no, and it's an interesting insight that you're having there, because it's also the concept of how we romanticize many of the behaviors that are linked with a drug abuser lifestyle, which is actually very negative, but it is sort of glamorized in a way that it appears reinforcing or rewarding. And for that person, that, as you say, that reinforcing rewarding component relate to the fact that they've conditioned, they associated that state with the pleasure that they feel when they are taking the drug, or the relief of the negative state, depending on where they are in the stage of their addictive process. So indeed, it is negative. And as a society, the problem of criminalizing the use of drugs is that when you are addicted to a drug, you already have very low self-esteem. You've already isolated yourself from friends. Your support systems are down the drain. And we do know that one of the factors that increase the risk of taking drugs and addiction, that transition, is stressors. So what can be worse as a stressor than being thrown out in a prison or a jail? I mean, biologically, those stressors are going to render your brain more vulnerable to the addictiveness of drugs. And you can do that in an animal. You isolate them, and guess what? It's much easier to make them to take drugs. So, I mean, this is not complicated science. We actually are able now to understand why stressors and why isolation, for example, can be so devastating to your brain. It's probably one of the most adverse things that you can do to a human brain, isolate them.
Yeah.
Very stressful, lack of stimulation. And so that's what we're doing when we're putting someone in prison or jail. I mean, the only saving grace, I would say, is when you provide a treatment. So if a person is addicted and ends up for XYZ reason in prison or jail, it behooves you to take that opportunity to treat them for their substance use disorder, so that when they leave the prison system, you can provide a support that will increase the likelihood they succeed staying free from drugs and prevent their relapsing into reincarceration.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to Doctors Nora Volkow and Daria Kus. A really interesting couple of conversations, and great to look at, if not all sides, then certainly very many sides of the issues of addiction. We've had a couple of other addiction episodes in the past. It's a topic that I think is worth coming back to. I wouldn't say I'm addicted to the topic of addiction, but the record of episodes might prove otherwise. But if you go to the webpage for this episode, I will link back to those previous episodes. There's definitely some good ones in there. And I think that one of the key takeaways that addiction is sort of learning gone bad, or the dark side of the brain's ability to learn, is just an incredibly interesting way of thinking about what's going on in the brain in these cases. I think it gives both a lot more understanding of what addiction actually is, and also a lot more empathy for the people that are suffering and dealing with addiction. In some ways, their brain has just learned something very, very powerfully and is then misapplying that learning. I also think that it's very important that society comes to grips with addiction, understanding it in a more general sense as well as possible, as quickly as possible, because sort of the downside of technology and abundance is that we are more and more able to give ourselves things that we like, and sometimes more of those things than are actually good for us. So again, a big thank you to both doctors for sharing their insights, and now we will move on to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So you've probably heard of alcohol, and you've probably heard that alcohol does not have much of a reputation as far as cognitive enhancement goes. Motor functions are famously impaired, response time goes down, executive functions, including the ability to pay attention to things, to remember things, and to inhibit inappropriate behaviors, are all adversely affected by alcohol. This is a surprise to no one. But on the other hand, alcohol does have its uses, does have its proponents, certainly. And one anecdotal cognitive benefit that people talk about is that a lot of multilingual speakers think that they can actually speak their non-native language better if they've had a couple of drinks. The question that one asks is, do they really speak better, or is it just more fun because they're a little bit buzzed and so they think they're speaking better? This is a question you could just wonder about, or if you're a research scientist, you could actually try to find out the answer. And luckily for us, a conglomeration of scientists at the University of Liverpool, Maastricht University, and King's College London all teamed up to investigate this very issue. Their study was recently published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. And what they did is they found 50 native German speakers who were studying at a Dutch university. This was Maastricht University, and they'd recently learned to speak, read, and write in Dutch. The participants were then randomized according to the trial, and they either consumed a control beverage that did not contain alcohol or a low dose of alcohol. The exact amount of alcohol that the alcohol drinkers got was based on their body weight, but it would have been just under about a pint of 5% beer for a 155-pound guy. So they drank something either with alcohol or without, and they chatted with an experimenter in Dutch for a few minutes. The chat was audio recorded, and then later on, two native Dutch speakers who didn't know which of the participants had or hadn't consumed alcohol listened to the conversation and rated everybody on their Dutch speaking abilities. The participants also rated how they thought they did speaking in Dutch during the conversation. And this one proved to be a win for alcohol. The alcohol drinkers were rated by the observers as speaking significantly better Dutch, specifically better in their pronunciation, but also just generally better overall. Interestingly, the alcohol had no effect on the people's self-ratings of their Dutch speaking. So the alcohol drinkers couldn't tell personally whether they were actually speaking better, at least not reliably so, but according to third-party listeners, they were. Said Dr. Inge Kersbergen from the University of Liverpool, our study shows that acute alcohol consumption may have beneficial effects on the pronunciation of a foreign language in people who recently learned that language. This provides some support for the lay belief among bilingual speakers that a low dose of alcohol can improve their ability to speak a second language. And making a point that was probably obvious to everybody, Dr. Fritz Renner, who is also involved with the study, said, it's important to point out the participants in this study consumed a low dose of alcohol. Higher levels of alcohol consumption might not have beneficial effects on the pronunciation of a foreign language.
The Smart Drug Smarts Podcast, because being damn smart is always in season.
Okay, so that was it for episode number 209. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find everything that we talked about here up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/209. If you missed last week's episode, in episode number 208, I spoke with Dr. Daniel Stickler about genetics, epigenetics, and bioinformatics and how we can use each of those and all of the above to benefit our individual health. Next week, I won't pinky swear to it yet, but I think we might be having the long-awaited episode on MDMA versus PTSD, an acronym cage match. But it'll be something good in any event. I will see you back here next Friday. Same time, same podcast, and with that same unwavering commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, stay warm, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts Podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.